Another new feature in ASP.NET MVC 5.1 are authentication filters. In earlier versions of MVC, authentication tasks would typically be bundled with the authorization filter. Basically, if a person needed a certain authorization and they didn't have it, then it would redirect them to a login page where they could then log into the application. But now in MVC 5, authentication filters have been added to better separate the concerns of authentication and authorization. As you may remember, authentication is identifying who the person is. Authorization is identifying what the person can do. In MVC 5, these are actually used in combination. These authentication filters are used in combination with the authorization filter. If a person is not authenticated, then the authentication filter takes care of that authentication. If they are authenticated, then it passes to the authorization filter. And if they don't have the proper authorization to execute that controller action, then it redirects them to the actual login page. Authentication filters are used in combination with the authorization filter. When the page loads up, when the request is made, if the person is not authenticated, and they need to be, they'll be redirected to the login page to then log in. If they are authenticated, then when the authorization filter checks to see if they're authorized, if they're not authorized, then the authorization filter will contact the authentication filter and prompt the user for the credentials that are needed to access that resource. Authentication filters implement the new iAuthentication filter interface. The first method on the interface is onAuthentication. This runs before any other filters, and it actually performs authentication. The second one is the onAuthentication challenge. When the user making the request is not properly authenticated or does not have the proper authorization, this method is run and typically will redirect the user to a login page. For our authentication filter demo, we're going to add an authentication filter to perform some type of custom authentication. And we're actually going to use a custom principal object to store some additional information about the authenticated user. In this demo, we're going to demo the new authentication filters feature of MVC 5. To get started, we first need to create a new project. So we're going to click File, New, and then Project. We're going to select ASP.NET Web Application Project. We're going to leave the default project name the same, and we're going to click OK. Then we're going to come up here and click on the MVC template. We're going to make sure that we have the checkbox here for the MVC folders and core references checked. We're going to change authentication to no authentication. We're not going to be adding any unit tests to this project, nor are we going to be hosting it in the cloud, so we'll just click OK. Now that Visual Studio has completed or created our project, the first thing we're going to do is actually rebuild it and then run it to make sure that it works as expected. All right, excellent. It compiled, and now we'll run it. Okay, excellent. Our project ran. Now, in this demo for authentication filters, we're first going to start by creating an admin controller. We're actually going to build an admin login page and a very simple admin dashboard. So we'll come into controllers, and we are going to add a new controller. We're going to go with an MVC5 controller empty. Click Add. We're going to type in our name. It's going to be admin controller. All right, we now have our admin controller. We're actually going to have a second controller action called dashboard. All right, first we're going to create our index view. We'll use our standard layout page. Okay. And then we're going to create a dashboard view. Okay, excellent. Now to make sure that all of this was created correctly, let's quickly run the project and go to those two pages. come up here, we'll type admin/index, and we get the admin index page, and we'll type admin/dashboard, and we get the dashboard page. Now on the index page, we are actually going to build a very, very simple login form. So underneath index, type in using HTML begin form. Now, what we're going to do is a little bit different here. When we submit our login form, we're actually going to have them go directly to the dashboard. Many times you would actually submit it back to the same controller action that actually rendered the page. But to demonstrate the authentication filters and what you can do with them, we're actually going to have it submit it back to the actual dashboard page. So we're going to call it dashboard, be our controller action, and then admin for our controller. Put in our curly braces. All right, now let's build a very, very simple HTML login form. Put in a text box for our username. Now we'll just put a very simple line break here. Label, password, capital P, text box, password, put another simple line break, then we'll just put a simple input type submit, make our value be sign in. Okay, and up here, we'll remove that little semicolon. So now we have our login page. Next, we're going to build our dashboard page. So up here, all we're going to basically do here is we're going to display some information about the user who's currently logged in. Let's put a little line break, username, we'll grab the user that's currently logged in, and we'll grab their identity name. Next, we want to display their email information, which we're going to collect a little later. We're actually going to pull it from the view bag. So we'll just call it viewbag.email. And then we'll have our phone number. And we'll pull that from the view bag too, so we'll be sure to set that in our controller action. Okay, so if we now run this, there's our dashboard with no information, and there's our login page with our little sign-in form here. All right, now let's go ahead and close that. Okay, now the next thing that we want to do is we actually want to go ahead and put some permission or put some security and other functionality within our admin controller. So for the index, we're going to leave this with just returning the view. But for our dashboard, we actually want to put a little bit of security on there. We only want to let people in there who are actually logged in. So before MVC 5, what we would typically do is just throw on an authorize attribute, then put in our parameter for our roles, and for this we're only going to allow administrators to actually see this actual page. And then inside of our dashboard, we're actually going to populate our view bag with some important information. Now right now I'm just going to set it to an empty string because we haven't created all of our objects yet that we need. Viewbag.email, viewbag.phone. There we go. Okay, So now we kind of have the framework here built to actually add in our authentication filter, and we're also going to create our own special, very simple principal object to use with our authentication filter. So the next thing that I want to do is I actually want to add a new folder called filters. And in this filters folder, I'm going to add a new class. And this class is going to be called Simple Authentication Attribute. All right, so here's my public class simple authentication attribute. As you probably already know, whenever you're writing an attribute code, or whenever you're creating an attribute class, it always has to end, the class name always has to end with the word attribute. You don't include this attribute word in the actual attribute itself, but by ending it in attribute, it lets C# know that this is going to be an attribute class. All right, so for our filter here, the first thing we're going to do is inherit from action filter attribute. And this is going to make it an action filter for our MVC application. The next thing we want to do is we want to have it implement the authentication filter. And so I'm going to hold down Control and hit dot, and it's going to give me the namespace that I can choose from, and so there's my authentication filter. So now I'm going to right click on this, and I'm actually going to implement the interface. So now I've got the two methods that I actually have to put some code into to make this authentication filter work correctly. So before we do that, though, we're going to go ahead and create one of our new models that we need. And this model is going to be called the simple principal. And basically all it's going to do is we're going to create a new principal object that has not only the username, but also the phone and email. So we'll call this simple principal. Okay. Now this simple principal is actually going to implement iPrincipal so that we can use it in other parts of the application. And we will implement the interface. So we have two things that we have to provide information for, the identity and then isEnroll. So what we're going to do, we're going to add a constructor to this called simple principal, and it's going to accept an identity, an array of roles, an email address, as well as a phone. Okay, so down here we'll go ahead and quickly set up two properties for our email and phone. And then we can just come up here and say email, email, phone, phone. Okay. Up here we're going to create two private fields, one for identity, and then one for our roles. We'll come back down to our constructor, and we're going to set our identity to identity, and our roles to roles. And then down here, we will return our identity. And then down here, roles contains role. Okay, so this is our simple principal. All it's basically doing is accepting an identity as a constructor parameter, a list of roles, an email address, and a phone number, and then assigning it to those properties. And then as part of the iPrincipal interface, we have to return the identity. And we also have to have the ability to see if this particular principal contains a certain role. Okay, so now we're going to go back to our simple authentication attribute. And we're going to implement the methods in here. First, we need to go ahead and declare an identity object that we're going to make use of for setting up our user on the on authentication. Come in here. Okay. Now, as we discussed before, on authentication can actually do the authentication for us. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically set up a little login system here where a person logs in on a form, the form data gets submitted, then we want our authentication filter to actually intercept that form data, look for a username. If it finds one, we're just going to assume that the credentials are correct. But if it finds the username, we want it to create an identity and set it up within our simple principal and then assign it back to our filter context. And so that would basically take care of logging the person into the system. And then in the on authentication challenge, we're actually going to check to see if the person is authenticated, and if they're not, we're going to redirect them to the login page. So the first thing we want to do is if we want to intercept form data, we have to grab the form data from the filter context. So filter context, HTTP context, request dot form. And that's going to get us access to our form data. Now the next thing we want to do is we actually want to check that form data to see if there's an actual username in there. So we're going to do is null or white space, or not is null white space, then form data, username. And so if the person submitted a username in the form data, this is where we're going to do the actual setting up of the identity. If they didn't do that, then we're going to pull the identity from the form's authentication cookie. So let's first set it up for a person who's first logging in. We'll do forms authentication. And we will set auth cookie. We'll actually come up here and grab this. Put that right into there. So now we have a forms authentication cookie based upon the username of the person. Next, we're going to, we also have to tell it whether or not to persist. We'll actually have it persist. There we go. User identity equal new. We'll just use a generic identity. And we're going to pass into it our username. And now we have our generic identity set up. So basically what's happened here is this. If the username has been passed in the form data, we go ahead and create a cookie for it, and then we create a new identity. When we actually create this new generic identity, the is authenticated property is actually going to be automatically set to true, which we'll be needing in the on authentication challenge. So now we come down here. Now this is for a situation where the person has already possibly authenticated. The username is not present in the form data, so we're assuming they're logged in. So we now need to grab their username from the form authentication ticket. So we'll do var ticket equal to forms authentication.decrypt. All right, now in here, we're actually going to have to pass in the cookie for the authentication ticket. So what we're going to do is up here, we're going to actually call var cookie equal to HTTP context current request cookies. And now we want to do the forms authentication forms cookie name, and that is actually going to return our cookie to us. And then we'll come down here and do cookie.value. And now we have access to our ticket. Now, once we have access to our ticket, we have the ability to set up our user identity. Generic identity, ticket, and name. There we go. So now the very last thing we want to do is to actually set up our new principal object that has our extra information. So filter context, principal. I'm going to do new simple principal. And we're going to grab it from our models namespace. Now in here we pass our user identity. And for our roles, string, and phone, what we're going to do is we're just going to put hard-coded values in there. Ordinarily, you would look this up in a database or some type of other storage or third-party provider to actually determine what this information is. But for the sake of our example, we're just going to hard-code it. New. We're going to make this person an administrator. Email. eric@ericwgreen.com, comma, phone number 123-123-1234. Okay, and so now we have set up our new simple principal. Now down here, in the on authentication challenge, here we actually want to check to see if the person is logged in. So we'll come in here and do if not, filter context, HTTP context user, identity is authenticated. Then what we want to do is actually redirect them to the login form. And the way we do that is actually to set the result object, result property, to a new redirect to route result. And we're going to have to pass in a new route value dictionary. And in here, actually I want to take that off. And in here, we're going to pass in our controller, which is going to be admin. And then we want to pass in our action, which is going to be index, which is the location of our login page. Okay, we are almost done. So basically what we've done here is that when a page gets loaded up, it calls the on authentication. If the person is attempting to log in because the username value is in the form data, then we go ahead and set up their auth cookie and create their generic identity. Or if they're already logged in, we come here and we grab their forms authentication cookie, we decrypt it, and from that we grab their name and we create their generic identity. And then we pass it all into our simple principal object and then assign that principal object to our actual principal in the filter context. And then down here we're just checking to see if they're authenticated, and if they're not, we're redirecting them to the login page. So now we'll jump back over to the admin controller, and we have a couple of pieces of code left to add here. The first thing we're going to want to add is we're actually going to add our attribute. So we'll call this simple authentication. And we'll pull it from our filters namespace, and so there we go. And now the last thing we're going to want to do is actually access that new principal object that we've created. Simple principal. Grab it from our models namespace. And we're going to grab it from our controller context .http context.user. And then we'll come down here. We'll grab our principal, and we will grab our email, and our phone. So now we should be able to build our solution. Everything built successfully. Now we can come in here and run it. Now we're going to go to the default home page. So we'll type in admin index. It's going to give us a login page. So now I'm actually going to type in my made-up credentials. I'll be an admin, and I'll just type in any password I want. And I will click sign in. And now, as you can see, I'm actually logged in as admin, and there's my email, and there's my phone number. Okay, so let's take a look quickly at what happened. So we're going to go back to our simple authentication attribute. And we'll go up here, and we'll set a breakpoint right here. Now we're going to load this up. Okay, now we're going to type in admin, go to the index. We're going to log in. So again, just make up a login information. We'll sign in. So now I've come into my actual simple authentication attribute in the on authentication method. And here's my filter context. And you can see here, I'm actually now grabbing my form data. And so if I step over that, if we look at form data, we're going to see that in here I actually have my username and I have my password. So it's actually grabbing it right from the form data that was posted. And then here it's going to check to see if it's not null or white space, which it's not because we have a value here for username. And then we're going to set the authentication cookie with that logged in name, and then we're going to set our generic identity. And then it sets up our principal, and we continue on to the dashboard page. Now if we want to load the dashboard page again, we can reload it. This time it's going to check to see if our form data has that username. And it doesn't. There's nothing in the form data because I just did a GET request on the dashboard that time right from the browser. So we're going to jump into this part down here, and we're going to see that it's going to pull a cookie value. So there's our forms authentication ticket. It's going to decrypt our ticket, and as you can see, there's our name that we typed in, admin. And then we're going to continue on down to setting our principal once again with our user identity with our name as admin. And we're going to continue. And now on the page you can see the information. I could even go back to the index page and you see the form, and then I can immediately jump back over to the dashboard, and we'll just let this run all the way through. And you can see I'm still logged in because it's pulling that information from the forms authentication ticket cookie.